Hello everyone and welcome to my first ever YouTube video. If you want to follow me on other platforms, this is my Instagram and then also my book talk. We'll see if that ends up staying or not. But I just want you to be able to find me on all my socials. But I figured might as well start some long form content. This is going to be probably a bit of a bumpy ride, but I am very excited to be a part of the BookTube community now, so let's get into it. I read some amazing books last year. I read 170 books and I loved a lot of them. But I want to talk about today some of my biggest surprises, books that I read that I didn't expect to be obsessed with and I ended up really loving. And then I also wanted to talk about some books that I really did not like and I expected to love them because everybody raved about them, but for me, it just was not it. So first we're going to talk about Bride because I was not expecting to love this book. I'm not somebody who reads paranormal romance a whole lot. Well, since reading Bride, I've read quite a few paranormal romances, but before this book, I hadn't read any. I am one who loves contemporary romance. It's my sweet spot, but Bride was so good. I loved everything about this book. I loved the fact that Misery and Lo had to be forced to be married in order to keep their people happy. The fact that Misery does everything for everybody else and never has had somebody step up and be like, you know what, how about you take a step back and let me do stuff for you? And then she meets Lo, who is going to do just that, who's going to keep peanut butter in his house for her, who's going to make sure that she is loved and cared for. When she gets sick and he does not leave her side, I loved that. And I also loved the relationship between Lo and his younger sister and also Misery and Lo's younger sister. I just felt like that is an additional dynamic that I love to see in romance books when there's a kid involved because you get to see a little bit more of a playful side of the characters. So I loved this book. I love paranormal romance now. And honestly, the nodding, I know that some people were like, oh, the nodding is weird. I enjoyed it. So for me, this was a top tier book. And then we have Leather and Lark. This book, I was expecting something different, which is why it surprised me, but I didn't expect it to be as much of a love story. For me, the whole fake marriage piece, I was like, okay, cool, that's fine. But when I was reading Butcher and Blackbird, it was very much focused on the serial killer aspect versus when you read Leather and Lark, it's very much around the romance. And sure, there are obviously the serial killer vibes and it's still a dark romance, but it's not the same as Butcher and Blackbird, which I'm very happy about. I loved the book. I loved that Lark was the unhinged character. I loved that Lachlan all of a sudden was this golden retriever cinnamon roll guy. I was obsessed with so much in this book and I thought it was so good. I know that some people complained because they wanted more of the serial killer aspect, a little bit more of the dark romance, but I loved that entire book and I cannot wait for Scythe and Sparrow to come out. And then up next we have Birthday Girl. I didn't expect to like an age gap romance that had to do with ex-boyfriend's dad. I knew it was going to be taboo walking into it, but I was like, you know what, this probably isn't going to be for me, but since it's so hyped and so talked about, let me at least read it so then I at least know what everybody's talking about. And then I picked up the book and it was so good. I'm obsessed with Pike. Pike is fine and he is perfect and his job and how he's built his life and his career and how he finds his son as such a disappointment and how he really wants to do a lot better in life and all this stuff. I just found this book to be so good. I have read another ex-boyfriend's dad book since then by Chelsea Curdell for Christmas and it was equally as good. I don't know, is this my new favorite type of book? Probably not. However, I did find it just so good. And I think the biggest thing for me was that the ex-boyfriend was a crappy guy, so I didn't really care that he was left away. And then we have Plan Barbarians. Now for me, I wasn't thinking that the Omegaverse was going to be for me. So I was like, you know what, maybe not. But then I just kept on hearing so many people talk about it. So I was like, okay, let's give it a try. And I do have to say that the first book getting into it was a little rough because I didn't realize that there was going to be bad things happening to the female characters while they're on this spaceship, but there was some bad things. And so after that, I liked the story a whole lot more. I love the whole not Hoth planet. I love all of the characters in this. I've read 1 through 6, I believe now, and it's my goal to read all of the books in 2025. I'm reading one a week. And so I've really enjoyed the books that I've read so far. I like that all of them, although they're shorter, novellas, 200 pages, they all have really dynamic stories, and because you don't have to introduce the world to us time and time again, we kind of can cut out some of the repetitiveness that you would need if these books were separate. I really have enjoyed all of the dynamic characters in it. I have really enjoyed the fact that all of the men are different, all of the women are different, and they're all facing their own struggles and stuff. And so you're seeing a lot of character development and growth even within just a short novella. So I'm really excited to continue reading the series. And then we have Binding 13. Now, I was hesitant to pick this one up because it's about teenagers. I don't like to read about teenagers. Even if there's somebody who's like 18, 19, 20, I age them up in my mind. I'm in my late 20s, so I don't need to be reading about teenagers anymore because it crosses too many lines for me. But Binding 13, I think, did it well. I loved the whole like rugby aspect of it. I've never played rugby, seen rugby, any of like that kind of stuff. So learning about that sport to me was cool. I loved the relationship between Johnny and Shannon. I loved the fact that Shannon like came from this school and like this background in this life where she was just consistently bullied and she just was so unhappy and miserable. And then she moves to the school that her parents like cannot afford, but they're crappy people, so who cares anyways. But then she's able to like run into Johnny, and then she has like a solid group of girlfriends, and the solid group of girlfriends also hangs out with those guys. And like, I don't know, for me, it just was like the perfect wrap up so that like Shannon and Johnny could become friends before they could become more. Johnny Kavanagh is the expectation now because this man steps up in every single way that he can. He never looks down on Shannon. He's always there to support her. He's there to love her. He's there to stand by her side and do exactly what she needs to be done. And he sticks up for her in every single moment. And I'm just like so appreciative of him. And Shannon, oh my goodness, talk about somebody who's had a rough life and she has to like basically rise out of the ashes time and time again. I love everything about this. I read Binding 13 and Redeeming 13 back to back because I needed to. But it was a lot of pages. It was like 1,300 pages. So for me, the books are a little long and some of the scenes could have been condensed more so that I didn't have to like drag through some of the scenes. But for the most part, I love these books and I have to mentally prepare to read the next books about Joey. So obviously I loved those books, but I think it's time to turn the page and talk about some of my biggest disappointments because some of the books that I read this year, I was expecting so much more from, and they just turned out to be so not it for me. So first we're gonna talk about Powerless, and I don't wanna talk about the whole like comparisons to Hunger Games or Red Queen or those kinds of things because I feel like that's been talked about enough. So let's get into the other reasons that I did not like this book. So for me, there was no world building. I do not understand why the trials were happening. I didn't fully understand why there was a separation from the people who had powers versus the people who didn't. I didn't fully understand like the background into any of these things. And I'm not much of a fantasy reader, so I like to stay kind of on the more fantasy that is recommended for people who don't read fantasy, and Powerless and Fourth Wing are kind of like those books in that category. So I was like, cool, this will be great for me. I knew it was YA going into it, so I was like, all right, this is gonna be fun, whatever else. But there was just like no background. There was no time spent kind of growing the story. And for me, that just made it a very confusing read because I didn't have the background information that I needed. I did love the banter between Kai and Peyton. I felt like that was done really well. The whole thing with like his brother Kit and Kai needed to have a conversation at some point to be like, hey, do you like her? Yeah, I like her. Okay, well, you like her? Like, it's just weird to me because I feel like siblings would talk about these kinds of things. So that kind of tension I didn't fully get. But then once we got into the trials, I liked the trials part of it. I liked kind of like the tension that came from those things. I liked how they were able to like work together. So it's like Hunger Games, but not really Hunger Games because like it's not like everybody had to die or whatever else. And so like I liked those kinds of pieces of the book, but overall I felt like there was a lot of substance that was just missing. And my issue is that then I read Powerful, and I wish Powerful, really just Adina's chapters, were put into Powerless because I think that would have made it a much stronger story. I think that I would have learned a little bit more about like what was going on, and I would have appreciated Adina more as a character versus just being so focused on Peyton and Kai. I felt like at some points it felt very much like a romance book versus a like fantasy book. So I wanted more of like those fantasy aspects, but I did love the gowns. So didn't like Powerless, and then I decided to pick up Powerful, which Powerful was fine, and then I picked up Reckless. I should not have picked up Reckless. What was that book? Why did we go into a complete circle? Like literally nothing happened. And I was watching another video of another creator who was talking about how the chains that they were like tethered to were different lengths depending on like what part of the book that you were in. And so like things like that to me are just sloppy. And if I'm going to read a book, I don't want it to just be a filler book because you want to sell a book. I think that the Powerless, I mean, who knows what's going to happen in the third book, but I think Powerless probably could have been a duology instead of a trilogy, and there didn't need to be this third book that was just a filler. The big thing that happened at the end was shocking, sure, but beyond that, like none of the other parts of the story really needed to happen. And Kai being so upset because of like what happened at the end of Powerless versus like what he did to her dad. I'm like, dude, you can't have it both ways. You have to realize that she did something bad to your dad, you did something bad to her dad. Like, let's just call it good at that point, or let's just be upset. But like, you can't be more mad at her for like what she did versus like what you did. I don't know. That part annoyed me. And for me, this book was just a filler and I just did not like it. I decided to read The Friend Zone by Abby Jimenez. I had picked up her Part of Your World series, absolutely loved that, crushed that series. And then I picked up The Friend Zone and I could not stand this book. I wanted the FMC in this book to have a conversation with Josh at any point. Kristen would not talk about anything ever. And it just like, it frustrates me so much when you're reading a romance book, especially contemporary romance, and miscommunication is the entire plot. And I realized that in her Part of Your World series, there's miscommunication throughout, but it seems to be done better. So I definitely think that she's gotten better as an author. But for me, the miscommunication in Friend Zone drove me nuts. I know that she has endometriosis. I know that like that's a hard topic for women to discuss, and that's not something that you like come out and just like talk about with everyone. But Josh kept on asking over and over again, like, hey, is there anything that I can do? Like, is there a reason that like these things are going on? And she could have just sat him down and been like, hey, you know what? I don't necessarily want to talk about this, but you want a big family. I'm not sure I'll ever be able to have a big family. And like, if they could have at least talked at some point, then Josh could have reassured her way earlier on, and that had to have been the entire plot. So 2024 was the year that I decided to give the Ravenhood series a try. Do I have regrets? Yes, I do. Because what are these books? So I read Flock and Exodus, and I'm gonna talk about them at the same time. But for starters, Flock. I was confused the entire time. I didn't like Cecilia as an FMC. I thought she was really annoying. I liked Dom and Sean. I actually liked like their dynamic, and I liked the like wide shoes pieces of this book. I liked that, you know, Sean was a little bit more of like a free flowing. He was a little bit like more bubbly and charming, and Dom was very much like this grumpy guy that was closed off, but like had a love for books and like all these things that like really brought Cecilia in. I loved the romance part of this. The part that I did not like was the plot, because I am so confused, and I would think that by the time I got to the end of the book, I would at least know a little bit of what was going on. And I was honestly so lost the entire book that I was like, you know what? Let's read the second book to see what happens. So then comes Exodus. So I was like, you know what? I'll read Exodus and let's see what happens. And then all of a sudden Tobias is introduced. And I'm like, what? Like the people that I liked from the first book aren't even in this book, or they're like gone doing whatever else they need to do. And so I was like, okay, you know what? Fine. Let's just read through it. I don't like Tobias. I don't like him at all. I understand why he's grumpy, growly, whatever. I understand the tension between like his family and like her dad, and how her dad is like not a good dude and like all this stuff. I get all that stuff. However, Cecilia did not live with her dad for a lot of years, so I don't understand why there was so much tension on that aspect, because like she literally doesn't even really know her dad. And I thought we would find more about, you know, like the brotherhood and like those kinds of things, and I discovered nothing. And then by the end of the book, when the bad thing happens, I wasn't even sad because I didn't feel attached enough to any of the characters. Like if that had happened earlier on, maybe I would have been more upset. But for the most part, I did not feel attached to these characters at all. And so for me, I just was like, like this is fine, but it's not anything that I like really wanted to pursue more. So I didn't read the third book. I know a lot of people are like, oh, all of your questions will be answered in the third book. But if I have to get through 3 books and I'm still confused, like it's not a series for me, and I don't know, I just wanted more, and I also don't like reading books where I do not like any of the characters. All right, so I know I'm a bit of a fast talker, so I know this video is probably going to be a little bit shorter than I kind of had planned, but I hope that you enjoyed watching my first ever YouTube video, and if there's anything that you want me to talk about, just let me know in the comments.